Hoffman Studios Book Club proudly presents In Another Country by David Constantine, read by Richard Hoffman. When Mrs. Mercer came in, she found her husband looking poorly. "What's the matter now?" she asked, putting down her bags. It startled him. "Can't leave you for a minute," she said. "They've found her," he said. "Found who?" "That girl." "What girl?" "That girl I told you about." "What girl's that?" "Katya." "Katya?" said Mrs. Mercer, beginning to side away the breakfast things. "I don't remember any Katya. I don't remember you telling me about a Katya." "I tell you everything," he said. "I've always told you everything." "Not Katya, you haven't." She took his cup and saucer. "Have you finished here?" He had pushed them aside to make room for a dictionary. He was still in his dressing gown, with a letter in his hand. "My Katya," he said. "I couldn't finish my tea when I read the letter." "I see," said Mrs. Mercer. It worried her. Already it frightened her. Quickly she cleared the table. "Excuse me," she said, "while I shake the cloth." He raised the dictionary. "A name like that," she said, coming back the 2 steps from the kitchen door. "I'd have remembered it. She's foreign by the sound." "I told you," he said. His face had an injured look. One thing he could not bear was her not believing him when he said he'd told her things. "You forget," he said. "No, I do not," she said. "When, then?" That made him think. "A good while back, I grant you. It was a good while back." What worried Mrs. Mercer suddenly took shape. Into the little room came a rush of ghosts. She sat down opposite him, and both felt cold. "That Katya," she said. "Yes," he said. "They've found her in the ice." "I see," said Mrs. Mercer. After a while she said, "I see you found your book." "Yes," he said. "It was behind the pickles. You must have put it there." "I suppose I must," she said. It was an old Cassell's. There were words in the letter, in the handwriting he could not make out, and words in the dictionary he could hardly find, in the old Gothic script. Still, he had understood. "Years since I read a word of German," he said. "Funny how it starts coming back to you when you see it again." "I dare say," said Mrs. Mercer. The folded cloth lay between them on the polished table. "It's this global warming," he said, "that we keep hearing about." "What is?" she asked. "Why they found her after all this time." Though he was the one with the information, his face seemed to be asking her for help with it. "The snow's gone off the ice," he said. "You can see right in, and she's still in there, just the way she was." "I see," said Mrs. Mercer. "She would be, wouldn't she?" he added, "when you come to think about it." "Yes," said Mrs. Mercer. "When you come to think about it, I suppose she would." Again, with his face, and with a slight lifting of his mottled hands, he seemed to be asking her to help him comprehend. "Well," she said, after a pause, during which she drew the cloth towards her and folded it again and again. "Can't sit here all day. I've got my club." "Yes," he said, "it's Tuesday. You've got your club." She rose and made to leave the room, but halted in the door and said, "What are you going to do about it?" "Do?" he said. "Oh, nothing. What can I do?" All day in a trance. Katya in the ice. the chaste snow drawn off her. He cut himself shaving, stared at his face, tried to fetch out the 20-year-old from under his present skin. Trickle of blood, pink froth where it entered the soap. He tried to see through his eyes into wherever the soul or spirit or whatever you call it lives that doesn't age with the casing it is in. The little house oppressed him. There was not enough rooms to go from room to room in, nowhere to pace. He looked into the flagstone garden, but the neighbours either side were out and looking over. It drove him, only in his indoor clothes, out and along the road a little way, to where the road went down, suddenly, steeply, and the estate of all the same houses was redeemed by a view of the estuary, the mountains, and the open sea. He stood there, thinking of Katya in the ice, stood there so long the lady whose house he was outside standing there came out and asked, "Are you all right, Mr. Mercer?" "Fine," he said, and saw his own face mirrored in hers, ghastly. "I'm too old," he thought. "I don't want it all coming up in me again. We're both of us too old. We don't want it all welling up in us again." But it had begun. "No tea ready," said Mrs. Mercer, putting down her bag. He was sitting on the sofa, queerly to one side, as though somebody should be there next to him. "No," he said, "I didn't know what to get." The blood had dried black in a line down the middle of his chin. "Besides, I'm not feeling too good." "The one day in the week when you get the tea," said Mrs. Mercer. "I know," he said, "I'm sorry." She went to see to it. He came in after her, and hung in the doorway of the small room where they cooked and ate. His unease was palpable, whether to stand or sit, whether to speak or not. 2 or 3 times he shrugged. In the end he managed to say, "Where was the trip then?" "Protestin'," she answered brightly. "We went to Protestin'." "You always enjoy your trips," he said. "Yes," she said. "I wouldn't miss a Tuesday trip if I could help it." He had lapsed away again. His face was desolate and absent. His fingers, under their own compulsion, picked at one another. "Yes," she said. "We went to Protestin Market and I got myself a blouse." "I have to see it," he said. "I've been wondering," Mrs. Mercer said when they were face to face across the little table eating. "Why did they write to you about that girl? So long ago it happened, and didn't you tell me you were only passing through?" "I'm next of kin," he said. Mrs. Mercer put down her cup. "I beg your pardon?" "I mean, they think I am. She'd have no mother and father, would she, if you think about it? Besides, they were Jews, dead anyway of age, but very likely dead long before they died of age. And she was only a child, my Katya was." "Yes, but," Mrs. Mercer said, "yes, but so what? I don't see that makes you the next of kin." "Oh, I told them we were married," Mr. Mercer said. "I see," said Mrs. Mercer. "I had to, where we stayed. Not like nowadays. You had to say you were Mr. and Mrs. in those days, and wear a curtain ring." "We never did," said Mrs. Mercer. "We didn't have to, did we?" Mr. Mercer said. "We didn't have to because we really were." "And you two weren't?" "No, no," said Mr. Mercer. "I only said we were." "You never told me you were another woman's next of kin." I did, he said. Besides, I'm not. And if I didn't, it was so as not to upset you. The meal went on and finished. They watched some television. They went to bed. In the dark, it was immediately worse and worse. How old was she? Mrs. Mercer asked. Same age as you, he answered. Nearly to the day. I told you, you're both Virgo. Same age as me, she said. Still is if you think about it. They thought about it. So quiet that house was in the night. So quiet all the other little homes around it were that held the elderly in them, and the old, alone or still in couples, sleeping early, waking, lying awake, and thinking about the past. So much past every night, in the silence settling over those houses, that all looked much the same on a hillside creeping up against the rock and gorse, and tripping down to the river, where it widened, and ended in the sea. We went from village to village, said Mr. Mercer in the dark. We had a map to start with, but it soon gave out. We asked the way. Sometimes we had a guide from place to place. We had one when it happened, funnily enough. To be honest, said Mr. Mercer, I was a wee bit jealous of him. You mean she flirted? Mrs. Mercer asked. I mean, they had the language, and I was only learning still and couldn't always follow. They laughed a lot. They made some jokes I couldn't understand. Also, they went ahead a bit more than they needed to, perhaps. Or perhaps I let them. Perhaps I lagged behind on purpose and let them go ahead. I don't know why. We were on a path around a slippery purple rock, and the glacier on the right of us below. They were laughing. I must have let them go ahead. Then the path went around the rock face left, and they were out of sight. Last sound but one I heard from her was laughter, when she was already out of sight, and the very last, her scream. When I got there, she'd gone, and the guide was looking down. His face was dirty yellow, I remember. Was she a blonde? Mrs. Mercer asked. No, said Mr. Mercer. Her hair was black. I thought she'd be blonde, said Mrs. Mercer, being German. No, said Mr. Mercer. I told you when I told you the whole story her hair was like yours, black. Like mine, said Mrs. Mercer. Wednesday was library day. Same again, said Mr. Mercer. His hands were trembling. He had a scared look. Same sort of thing, said Mrs. Mercer. Mind how you go. Whatever is in there, behind the eyes, or around the heart, or whatever else it is, whatever it is that is not the husk of us, will cease when the husk does, but in the meantime never ages, does it? Explain him otherwise, his agitation when he thinks of Katya in the ice, her bodily warmth and merriment, night after night, as Mrs. Mercer, in the wooden houses, among flowers in the snow, comes up in him. An old man near the end inhabits him as thoroughly as does his renewing blood. Sweet first girl, sweet unimaginable shock of the simple sight of her the first time without her clothes. What am I going to do about it? He asks himself aloud. Nothing. What can I do? At dinner time, he said, this global warming. What about it? Mrs. Mercer said. I read some more about it in the library in a magazine. I've read the book you brought me, by the way, Mrs. Mercer said. Sorry, he said, they're very worried in Switzerland especially. Where's all the water going? The glaciers are melting, but the water's not come down yet. They think it's waiting like a dam." "I see," said Mrs. Mercer. "They fear it will all come down at once one day." "Very likely," said Mrs. Mercer. Then she said, "When you tell me she's still where she fell, does that mean people can see her if they go and look?" "Yes," said Mr. Mercer. "That's what the letter said. Still there, apparently, just the way she was, 20, in the dress of that day and age. She'll come down when the waters break, with mud and rocks, and anything human in the way of it will be wiped out. But we shall be dead by then, and turning in our own clay in the earth." In the night, in the utter silence of the nights among those little houses where old people live, she felt him leave the bed, and in the pitch black reach his dressing gown and leave the room. She let him go. How it troubled her, all this. Not much to ask. Peace of mind at nights and a bit of ordinary cheerfulness in the day. Some conversation, something to laugh about, and doing nobody any harm. And not all this. A slit of light came on under the bedroom door. She heard him fishing about above his head with the stick, tap, tap, for the hook to fetch the trap-door down and the ladder on it to mount into the loft. "He'll break his neck." But she heard the steps creak and the gasps of his exertion as he got up there. "He'll freeze to death." How cold it was in the space under the roof above their little living space, bitter cold and draughty, where they stored the past, its bulk and minutiae, in boxes, parcels, bags, on sagging shelves, in hidey-holes, diminishing with the rafters. She heard him on the ceiling above the bed, rooting around, the slithering of cartons, heard the efforts, then silence. She slept, woke in a sudden terror over his absence still, stood in her nightie at the foot of the ladder, cold even there, calling up to him till finally he showed himself, wrapped up and shivering, without his teeth, leaning over the hole, his face a blue-grey with the cold and grief. He leaned down over the hole above her upturned face, its halo of thin silver hair, and tried to say, "Nothing to worry about," but couldn't, and made a gibbering noise. The photos clutched two-handed against his heart. He slept late and shuffled in without a shave. His hand was shaking. She poured his tea. "That's enough now," she said. "Yes," he said, but asked could she remember where she had put the big atlas. "I just want to look," he said. "Under the sofa, since it was more wide than fat. And my boots," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "My boots. But those aren't the ones. No, no, but I always bought the same." She thought they might be in the shed, under the old fish tank. "That stick I brought back might be in there as well," he said. "I dare say," said Mrs. Mercer. "And will you make an appointment and get something to quiet you down?" He had found the photos and a book of hers he was carrying for her in his rucksack when she went ahead with the guide and out of sight fell down through the snow into a crack in the glacier. It was a book of poems in Gothic script, with a Nazi eagle stamped on the inside cover. In the pages were some gentians, flat and nearly black, but blue if you looked long enough, an eternal blue. In the photographs she was just as she was, slim in a long skirt, smiling, her black hair in a curve around her cheek. The white mountains were behind. The paths she stood on to be photographed often looked vertiginous, but were safe enough in reality, until the last one. They were heading south, more or less, trying to find a way into Italy, as she said she had always wanted to do. Her idea was there would be a last big climb, up very high, where it would be hard to get your breath, and after that all the streams would run the other way, and they would run down with them, getting warmer and warmer through an unbelievable profusion of flowers, and before long they would see the vines, and that would be Italy. But some days they forgot where they were going, and if a place was nice, they stayed. "One thing I didn't tell you," Mr. Mercer said the next morning, after a quieter night, though sleepless mostly, open-eyed and thinking. "Oh," said Mrs. Mercer, "you made an appointment to the doctor's, I hope." "Yes," he said, "this afternoon. I was thinking in the night, one thing I never told you. Never told anyone come to that, not a living soul. Nobody ever knew. I'm the only one in the world who knows it even now. Only one alive, I mean." "Well," said Mrs. Mercer. "She was going to have a baby, my Katya was." More and more slowly, Mrs. Mercer went on with her toast and homemade damps and jam. He sat, turning over his empty hands. His face, she knew, had she confronted it, was looking at her, with its puzzled and pleading look, the eyes behind the glasses rather washed out. "I suppose I thought it might upset you at the time." "I see," she said, after a while, when her mouth had given up trying to eat. "I suppose you would think that." Then she took her own things to the draining board and left him sitting there with his. They parted company, ate together, slept together, but were in separate circles. Almost at once, as though it were beyond his failing strength, he gave up pitying his wife and fell back down the decades into the couple of months of a summer in the Alps. Between thinking and muttering he went to and fro, up and down, never knew which he was in, and in her company, face to face over another meal, or side by side on a walk to the post office, addressed her or himself. "I wonder where you would put that big medical dictionary. It wasn't with the Cassells behind the jars. In the loft, perhaps?" The ladder to the loft was permanently down, encumbering the way into the little living room. A breath of cold hung over the opening, or the warmth of their living space, being drawn up there, was converted into cold just above their heads. He was often up there, rooting around. In the mechanism of her love and duty, she called him down when his meal was on the table. But also at nights he went up there, and she heard him moving and muttering over the bedroom ceiling. Then she wept herself to sleep for the unfairness. Surely to God it wasn't much to ask, that you get through to the end, and looking back, you don't fill with horror and disappointment and hopeless wishful thinking. All she wanted was to be able to say, "It hasn't been nothing. It hasn't been a waste of time. The 50 years, that they amount to something, if not a child, a something made and grown between man and wife you could be proud of, and nearly as substantial as a child." And now all this, him burrowing back through all the layers, him rooting through all their accumulations to get back to where he wanted to be in the time before she was. Once, with a bitterness that twisted her mouth as if the question were vinegar, she asked, "How far gone was she?" 6 weeks, Mr. Mercer answered. "We worked it out, it would be about 6 weeks." The fetus at 6 weeks is a tiny thing, hung in the mother like a creature in hibernation. The medical dictionary was in the loft, in that very cramped place where the eaves came down behind a sort of false wall made of hardboard. But Mr. Mercer found it finally, and in it a picture of the fetus at 6 weeks, and sat there under the bare bulb like an adolescent staring at it. What struck him most when he thought about him and Katya was their heedlessness. That was the word that came to him. We were heedless, because really, if it was bad where we were leaving, which was Bavaria, it was not much better where we were heading, which was Italy. And up there in the snow, the minute we set off, what did we do but go and get a baby? Heedless. For obviously we should have come down again sooner or later, out of the sharp air, the flowers, and the snow, and face up to our responsibilities in a bad world, getting worse. But then again, when he thought about it, it didn't seem heedless at all, because the thing he was most sure about, after all the years, was how sure they were all those years ago, that what he wanted with her and she with him was to have a baby and to go on living and living together for evermore. And you can't be called heedless when you know as well as that what your purpose is in life and you act accordingly. And though they weren't walking anywhere in particular, only to Italy, and where in Italy it didn't much matter, every day seemed to have enough point to it, getting from wherever they were to wherever they ended up, and finding somewhere nice to stay as Mr. and Mrs. with her brassy wedding ring. And days when they didn't go anywhere but stayed in bed and took a little stroll in the vicinity when they felt like it, seemed just as purposeful as days when they set off at 4 a.m, deadly serious. What did we do for food, I wonder? He asked himself up there in the roof space, as though somebody else was asking him. What did we have for money between us to go on like that, day after day, week after week? I can only suppose, he said to himself aloud or in his head, that God provided, and kind people along the way. I have the feeling, he said, that somehow people liked us, and somehow or other it gladdened them when we turned up. When Mr. Mercer thought of himself and her, he thought of certain flowers, and they were not the gentians that were beyond having any ideas about, but a bare and rather frail violet flower that came up actually in the ice. As soon as there was the least gap of grass or earth, and the water unfreezing around it and running fast, there you would see one or more of these frail flowers sprung up. Then, and more so now, he wanted to call these flowers brave. But a flower was a flower, and neither brave nor cowardly nor anything else. Yet the word brave came to mind when he thought of that quick seizing of a chance to spring up the minute the ice opened, even only a little. And that was how he thought of Katya and himself, after all that time, with Hitler where they'd come from, and Mussolini where they were going to. Up there, wandering around and making a baby the minute they turned their backs on civilization. Tuesday again. "Where's the trip today, then?" Mr. Mercer asked. It seemed to Mrs. Mercer he had aged 10 years in a week, if that were possible for a man his age already. "The Horseshoe Pass," she said brightly, "and the Swallow Falls, to see some scenery." "You'll enjoy that," he said. The minute the door closed after her, he put his boots on, that were not the boots, but like them because he had always bought the same, and packed a rucksack with the maps and some provisions for the journey. The maps were the very ones, in Gothic script, with a pair of hikers on the cover, in the costume of that time and place. He had found them in the loft with the photographs that he had against his heart, now in a wallet with the letter to prove he had a right to see her in the ice if anyone in authority challenged him. When he was ready with a hat and stick and money from the place he hid his in under one of the joists, he wrote a message to leave on the table for Mrs. Mercer when she came home from her trip. "Dear Kate," he wrote, "I am sorry about the tea again, but trust you will understand that I have to go and see her as the next of kin, and am sure it will be all back to normal here with you and me after that. P.S. I've made another appointment for a week on Monday. I think I'll ask him for something a bit stronger to quiet me down." Where the road drops away from among the same houses, Mr. Mercer paused for a moment over the view, over the estuary, over the river widening and giving itself up into the endless sea. A sunny light was on that place where sweet and salt meet, and the salt takes all the river in. All the streams of all the hills all along the way, and feels not a bit of difference, but continues vast and flat and through undrinkable. Kitted up to leave, with money and some biscuits for the journey, Mr. Mercer brought his mind to bear on a 6-week baby, beginning in a girl of 20, in the ice, now, after 60 years, uncovered because the glacier had lost its snow, and discovered in there, fresh. The kindly woman whose house he was standing outside must have watched him for a good 10 minutes from her front room window before she came out worried, and tried her best then, shaking him gently, speaking up close into his absent face, to get through to what was still alive in there behind his glasses and the glaze of tears. That was In Another Country, written by David Constantine, read by Richard Hoffman. This has been a Hoffman Studios Audiobook Club production.